We live in a fast-paced and hectic world where it's easy to feel overwhelmed, stressed, and out of control. How do you manage all the competing pressures without losing sense of yourself? How do you stay focused enough to not only plot a path, but follow it? Welcome to Master Your Life, a show that offers inspiration, insight, and intelligence, as well as success stories from many walks of life that can show you how you can control your own destiny. Our knowledgeable and entertaining host and her guests give practical advice that you can use every day in the quest to master your life. Now, here's your host, Leaha Mattinson.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's show. I'm host Leaha Mattinson, and joined today by the wonderful, knowledgeable world healer, I will call him, one of the world leading experts in nutraceuticals, therapeutics, Tim Dixon from Therapeutic Solutions by Community Shield. Tim, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Oh, yeah. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. I'm really excited to have you on every episode that we talk about things that are around health and healing, because right now in this world that we live in, more than ever, people are looking for solutions of that they can take themselves outside of the doctor's office. And that's what some of the things that we're talking about today. Yeah. We're going to focus in on concussions, and specifically because there's so many people with head trauma, head issues, that it's the number 2 searched term on the internet when it comes to health and healing, concussions.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, isn't it?
I didn't know that.
It's amazing, really, when you think about it, with all of the other diseases that are out there, around neurology. It's dementia's number 1 and concussions are number 2. So for those of you who missed the dementia episode, make sure you go back and listen to that. Today, we're going to focus in on concussions. So Tim, tell me about what your knowledge is around concussions and the group of people that you've been working with to help in the concussion world.
Yeah, so I think that concussion is sort of front and center for us because of our interest in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which comes from concussion, multiple concussion, micro, macro concussions, different concussions. But I find that stat very interesting, that it's the number 2 search thing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the awareness of concussion that we didn't have before. You know, certainly with big NFL players suffering from these concussive injuries and then having some, bad fallout in their own lives because of it. I think that has just, it's obvious. It's raised the awareness of people, because on the other hand, it's not like we're running around with an epidemic of people who are bonging people over the head with a hammer and so it's happening somewhere. Where? Sports primarily, right? So it's in the sports, and those are generally the contact sports: soccer, football, water polo, karate, all of these things that have contact where there's a potential for a concussion to take place. And by the way, it doesn't mean that the head has to be struck with a hand or a foot or an object. In the gameplay, they could fall and hit their heads, right? So I think that there's many ways that concussion can enter into a person's life. Listen, it can be that you're in the grocery store and you slip on something spilled in the aisle. It happens to people from time to time, and you bang your head on that hard concrete linoleum floor. Good chances you can get a concussion. Well, the good news is, I think for most people, they've had that first event like that. Tincture of time tends to heal that, right? Most people don't immediately find a nutraceutical solution for a concussion that they've just had. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I don't imagine that's the first thing that people think of. Oh my gosh, I better find a nutraceutical because I think I've had a concussion. It's generally that person is now pushed into neurology, right? Mm-hmm. Into the hands of the neurologist. And whatever the standard of care there is for concussion, that's kind of what's reigning. But on the other end, most of those people will do just fine. They'll recover from that. Now, if it's a serious head trauma, no, you're going to have long-term problems. But I'm talking, a small thing like that. Well, but what if you have a second one that happens before the first one really fully healed? Remember we were talking about the activation of these cells in the brain called microglia? Well, that's where it happens. You have this second concussive event. And now you have microglia that are activated, and they can begin producing all kinds of strange proteins and inflammatory molecules in the brain, that now this concussion, which was an acute event that just happened in a snap, has now become some chronic thing, right? Because there's something else that's going on in the brain. So what we look to do is to, on the natural side of things, using nutraceuticals, is find ways to deactivate that inflammation and the activation of those microglia. Because believe it or not, they're kind of the same cells that are involved in dementia that we were talking about last week. In fact, enough concussion will lead to dementia. It's not, and I don't think our interviews are necessarily in a particular sequence. Some of this stuff, Leah, runs together because there's a common organ involved, and that the biology of that organ is becoming better understood, maybe with each new brain injury that happens, right? I mean, I don't mean it that way, but it's not like we're looking for that to happen to generate information, but it does. And so a wealth of knowledge exists now. And I think that anything that you can do yourself to, if you've suffered an injury like that, and sometimes, you don't even know if you've had a concussion.
Right.
There's people who just slip. Some of our seniors slip and fall down all the time and bang. I see. Right. You see him. And I remember seeing a friend of mine. He had a big black eye, and his nose was all bruised. And he's an older guy in his 70s. I'm like, what happened? You won't believe it. I fell coming out of the shower and banged my face. And that. Yes. Did he have a concussion? I don't know. It's not that you have to hit some particular region, but if there's enough impact, I think you can have concussive forces in there that then can lead to these other long-term things.
Right. And I think it's a great point to talk about this building awareness, because I can remember in the early 90s, there was in NHL hockey, the hockey draft pick at that time was Eric Lindros, and Eric had major concussions, and he had lots and lots of trouble throughout his professional career. We've seen it with wrestlers, for sure, people taking their own lives. So we're maybe more aware of it on that athletic sports side. But the other side of people, and in seniors, the Huntington's disease community, people who have any kind of balance issue,
exactly.
People wipe out all the time. Yeah. It's very, very common to have head injuries. And then the other side of that scale is young people and children falling off of things. And I remember my kids falling off of monkey bars, slipping on ice in the playground. One of them actually whacked their head really bad, so bad, in fact, that they broke their nose, hit the back of their head and broke their nose. That's how bad the impact was.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. So really significant stuff. And then we've got our kids in these competitive sports. When you've got these size differentials between kids that are going through childhood and adolescence, you can see this massive difference. Some kids can be, under 3'1" or 3'2", and then other kids are, already hitting. They look like they're already pubescent, like they're in that 5'8", 5'9",
absolutely.
heavy, and
they have more mass per square inch of body,
and they don't know what the heck they're even doing with those bodies. They're so uncoordinated, and so you put them on skates and you give them a ball, they're running into the other players. It's like it's an accident waiting to happen. And also when we've got, people who've been in vehicle accidents, who've hit their heads on windshields, on, side of windshields. My son was in a pretty significant accident in high school, and he hit the front windshield with his forehead. And I asked, the people who he was staying with, please don't let him go to school. Like, don't tell him to stay home for a couple of days. They sent him to school. He had symptoms of concussion, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And he got invited to leave the school for a few days because it can make you pretty angry. You can have some things that are not your normal behavior.
Well, right, because those inflammatory molecules that are running around in there actually can excite the brain into actually having ideation and thought.
So let's talk about that. What are the symptoms of concussion? Some of the things that people might be able to look for in themselves or other people, or go, oh,
Well, first and foremost is the immediate response is disorientation, right?
Mm-hmm.
They come out of a concussion. If they literally were knocked unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
that's, you're waking up with an absence of memory for a period of time there, right? They don't know that whether they were flopping around on the ground or what, but all of a sudden they come out of this moment of trauma. Guarantee nobody at that moment is thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to end up with, some they're completely disoriented, right? I think it's after the fact. If there was significant injury there, a lot of times you don't want that child to go to sleep, right? Keep that child awake, right? You don't want them to go to sleep. I guess it depends on the degree of the injury. And a lot of times that's on mom and dad, right? Who are there that witness it. I mean, when we were kids, we jumped off of roofs,
Sure.
with sheets on our back, thinking we could fly. And all we did was go straight to the ground, right? Now we didn't bang our heads, but kids don't even think about any of that. They just do. And the parents are usually the ones that, witness it and make that decision at them. Do they need to go to the ER? I think there's a lot more awareness now, and there's probably more visits to doctors and ERs than ever before. And that's a good thing, because now you have actual situational awareness of that injury. That's when the parents need to then guard. They need to guard that child, not let them have another injury. There needs to be a period of time of healing. And I'm not suggesting we start pumping our kids full of nutraceuticals either necessarily. That's a parent's decision. It's supplemental food as far as we're concerned. It's part of the dietary circle of life. And so there isn't an issue there. But of course, that's a decision by parents to make, right? When it comes to adults, then adults can make those decisions, rapidly, right? But parents need, how do they know what they should give to their kid? Well, we're developing things that certainly are okay in children, neurostilbene that we talked about, and nanostilbene, right? These kinds of things. They certainly reduce all of that inflammation. So there would never be a problem with, look, you could potentially give your child the nanostilbene or neurostilbene before they go into the game of play. And then they have the active ingredient in their body that if there is an event, you can immediately go to work and begin reducing that inflammation. So there are preventative measures that can be done. But I also don't think that a lot of people are running around thinking about preventing this, because when it happens in an instant. Even in a car wreck, right? It's like 1 minute you're scooting along and the next minute you get rear-ended or side, swiped, and you crash your head or you get a whiplash kind of an injury. That may or may not produce the concussion, but it still produces inflammation, right? So even that you may not have had an unconscious event hitting your head in a car accident, right? But you still had enough deceleration in that instant that it caused brain injury. So you're right. There are lots of people out there with anything from very, very minor brain injury to severe. I mean, we were, we have right to try law here in the United States. And we've recently treated a comatose patient with stem cells who, just a young kid who was at college, out skateboarding, got hit by a truck, suffered a terrible, terrible brain injury. And here he is, he's 18 years old and he's in a bed in his parents' home, right? And he's completely comatose. Well, we've seen some response from those stem cells, and we certainly have reason to provide more stem cells to him. So nobody wants to see that extreme happen with these head injuries. Really what you and I are talking about is, kind of the daily occurrence where it can happen. I slipped down the stairs and I banged my head. I'm 65 years old. I lost my footing, right? Or I'm a kid playing soccer and I got tackled or whatever, or playing football, got tackled and banged my head. Or I rode my skateboard and, banged and fell off my skateboard and banged my head on the sidewalk. I mean, these are everyday occurrences, right?
And I think we see more and more because of the awareness thing, people talking more and more about their
They
brain.
do, and that's a great thing.
And their brain function problems, so where in the past people might have been hiding that they're having or laughed it off, and said, you know what, my memory isn't that good at 40 years old, 30 years old, you know, and they blame it on things like, oh, I've got baby brain. And then everyone in the, you know, the club goes, oh yeah, I remember when I had baby brain too.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Or
yeah.
I'm having a senior moment.
That's right. I'm having a senior moment. Oh, that's really normal and natural. It's not. So part of it's the re-education of ourselves, right? Of going, what really, you know, should be a well-functioning brain, even if you've got, you know, pre-existing conditions, or you've had some, you know, some people even argue that there's womb trauma when you come out of the, you know, out of the birth process. So, you know, there's very early on things that can happen. That just the acknowledgement that, you know, there you've got that your brain function isn't what you want it to be. So how's your executive functioning? That are you able to problem solve, decision make? Do you have good impulse control? You know, can you be relied on to pay your bills on time? You know, those kinds of things. And
how's your gait? How's your walk? Right?
How's your walk? Yeah. Oh, yes. I've had the walking test.
Indicator, right? That's a big indicator, because you see that forward motion. There's something going on, right? So,
I'm laughing because the family neurologist, the joke is when I go in to do my, you know, because of the Huntington's disease and family, I'll go in and do the little assessments every once in a while. But I get to do the gait assessment, and I always walk like a supermodel. Like, do you want me to give you a spin this way or that way? Which you got to have some fun with these things, guys, you know.
Well, yeah, of course. Right?
Yes, but the walking analysis is really important. And even like that, your ability to stretch your arms out to the sides and touch your nose with your fingers, you know, just like how well is your alignment in your body. And people spend so much time sitting, they sometimes don't even know. Nowadays, they don't even recognize when their gait's off. You know, so those walking assessments, and you can do those on your own too, like to check your balance. And this, so there's so many cool things that you can do to check out how you're doing.
Well, and listen, there's nothing wrong with a neurological examination, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And because these are serious things, right? And they can become chronic, long-term things that lead to all kinds of degradation. You know, it's the instant that it happens and the fallout from that, the disorientation, the pain of it, right? Whatever that happens in that moment, then it's the after, right?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the other symptoms of concussion. Do you see emotional symptoms happening from concussion, like anxiety where there didn't used to be, depression, suicide ideation? Has any of that come up in any of your studies?
Our research shows that the levels of these inflammatory molecules that you have, as they increase, things like suicidal ideation, depression, all of these things stem from the original release of those chemicals, those inflammatory chemicals in the brain. The idea is to get those out of the brain, right? And reduce them as quickly as possible. If you don't, and they continue to build up into levels, we've scored this where, just as an example, looking at the same molecules that I'm speaking about today, which is primarily a family of cytokines called interleukins. Interleukin 6 is sort of a big one that we look at. We found that, so we just completed a small clinical trial of 30 people. 10 were in a control, had no history of suicidal ideation, or any psychiatric issues at all. They were just a control group. The middle group had suicidal ideation, but had never acted upon it. And the third group had suicidal ideation and acted upon it during the study. So what we found out is that the middle group that had suicidal ideation had 3 times more of this inflammatory molecule in their brain than the control group did, the healthy individuals who had no history, and by the way, had no history of head trauma. So there would be no reason for us to find these molecules in their brain. Now, the ones who had suicidal ideation and actually acted upon it, they had 6 times the level as the control group. So what we see there is, as there's an increase in this marker, there's an increase in the propensity towards stages of suicide that can include things like depression, self-mutilation, self-harm, right? Even completely masking it. with a full intent of committing suicide. So these patients will completely mask what they're really feeling and really is going on in their minds. We can actually still discover that. We have a diagnostic where we can show that they're having those ideations, even if they're hiding them from their psychiatrist. So our view is that this is a biological imbalance that's occurring. Right. Yes, it can happen from trauma, concussion, but it can also happen because of other things. You could have brain cancer and begin developing these same levels of these inflammatory cytokines, because the tumor that is in your brain can also produce these molecules. So there's a whole host of brain injury that can lead to these things. So it isn't just concussion, it's the sequela of concussion, right? It's that if it's untreated, it can lead to depression. The untreated depression can lead to suicidal ideation, and the suicidal ideation can actually lead to suicide if there isn't intervention, right? And all of those things. But we've tied it all back to these molecules that we've been mapping for a long, long time, and we have a pretty strong foundation. In fact, we're getting ready to do 300 patients the next time around so that we can do a tenfold increase. So,
right. So cool. So does psychological trauma show up the same way in the brain?
We think it does. Yeah, we think that the brain that it's kind of an interesting thing. So just as a sidebar to this, the brain is a really powerful stimulator of our immune system because it can sense emotion. It has emotion, right? It has everything. It is our being, right? Our brains. Mm-hmm. So there's studies where they have taken people out and put them in the woods for 8 hours and then measured in their blood, looking for a cell called an NK cell. An NK cell is a really good cell to have in circulation because it kills pathogens and viruses and bad things and cancerous cells and all kinds of stuff. It's a very potent immune cell. But they took another group of people and put them in the city for that same 8-hour period of time, and they measured their blood. And not only did they not find any NK cells, and by the way, everybody had baseline blood draws. Not only did they not find any NK cells in their blood, they found all these same inflammatory biomarkers that I'm talking about. So just the stress of being in a city for 8 hours can induce these inflammatory stations, right, in organs, in our system-wide. So this powerful thing we have sitting on our shoulders can play a role in all of that.
Yeah, I'm really struck, Tim, by I was a counselor in the beginning of my career for a school division in Provost, Alberta, Canada. And I had 3 K-12 schools, 5 village schools, and a Hutterite colony that I provided counseling services for. So personal and career counseling. And I'm also the mother of 6 kids. So it's like I've had quite a range of experience with young people.
That's enough just right there, the 6 kids.
So 2 biological and then 4 stepchildren. And if the kids have always been in it, I've had lots of children in my life. And now the grandmother of 3 and another one on the way. And I'm speaking to this because this whole self-harm and, self-mutilation, I saw that that was 1991 when I started doing the counseling gig. And so that's a while, that's like 30 years ago that these conditions were showing up. And that I draw people's attention to that because the psychological harm hasn't reduced. And so we would see, it was at that time, I remember going, I cannot believe that why are people cutting themselves? And it was an honest question for myself. Why would somebody do that? What would cause somebody that much trauma? And then having children in my own life that had these behaviors, but because of emotional trauma, families breaking up causes harm. This whole past year of being in opposition to others in the planet. So, the virus thing and people being afraid of one another, mainstream media being a constant scoreboard of how many people have got whatever going on. There's this complete hiccup of normalcy, and that it would be akin to being in the war. I said when this thing first hit, there's going to be millions and millions of people who are dealing with PTSD. It's just going to be, the post-traumatic stress is going to be absolutely incredible unless we can get ahead ahead of this somehow. And again, so this is why when I discovered you guys, was connected with you and your work, I went, everyone's got to know about this, because no matter what side of any health issue you stand on, or political issue, or what you believe is the right path forward, everyone, I think, can agree that there has been psychological harm done to human beings over the span of the past, year and a bit. And so this again comes back.
Over, and it's not over.
And it's not over. It's not over. So it's like, what can we do to be preventative, but also to notice in other people? Just the huge ahas for me when you're saying about this self-harm and the self-mutilation, because that's one of the things that I really puzzled about for a long time. And it doesn't help to puzzle, though. Because it doesn't fix anything, but I also didn't have a solution. So it didn't seem to matter how much I spoke to somebody, clients about little people about this stuff. It didn't change their experience. It's like they couldn't change what they were doing to deal with the psychological harm, because their brain wasn't functioning properly. So we're trying to do counseling techniques for biological conditions, right? Yeah. So it's very, very challenging.
And not only that, you have the other side of that, the psychiatric side that is trying to use medications to balance that without ever analyzing the organ that they're treating. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. They're treating the psychiatric profession is the only profession that can treat a human organ and not be responsible to monitor it. Think about that. You go to the heart doctor and he gives you heart meds and doesn't monitor your heart, he's kind of guilty of malpractice and negligence, isn't he? And he'd be sued and he'd lose his license to practice. It would happen just like that. Mm-hmm. But yet they write the scripts for these drugs without actually knowing biologically what they're doing in the brain. Yeah. And that's where our focus is because we do believe it is a biological imbalance. And things in biology can be set straight again with counter biology, right? You got to think of it sometimes in terms of software, that there's a software program running that is hostile. And can you write an antivirus program to subdue that hostile program that is running in the brain? Because you have to think about this. What causes a person to take a razor blade out and cut themselves? Not intending to kill themselves, but to bleed and cut themselves and scar. Well, that one thing you would say, well, they obviously are desperate for some kind of attention, but they do this alone. It's not like they sit at the bar down the street and cut on themselves. Hey, Joe, what have you been fishing lately? While they're cut. No, they do this so what is it that is going on in the brain that leads a person to have the thought that says you should get a razor blade and you should cut yourself because this will make you feel better? Mm-hmm. It's chemicals. See, we don't find it odd that if you took LSD, that you would have very bizarre thoughts and maybe act out very bizarrely, or PCP, right? That people take and they completely lose it and strip naked in the middle of the street and chase cars. I mean, there's all these history of this, right?
Yes.
Well, we wouldn't think any of that was odd because we know it was a chemical that caused it, right? Now, we would even say it's not their fault. Maybe they were slipped that chemical in a bar in a drink, right? But yet they had these, how is it possible that a chemical can produce thought in the brain that tells you how powerful this immune system really is, that it can generate from negative sources, negative thoughts, negative feelings, and opposite, when you replace that, you know what oxytocin is? The love drug, right? The hug drug. Yes. So there's a synthetic form of it. But it's when you hug people, your pituitary glands pump out oxytocin. That's why it feels good to hug people. See, we lost something. And during this last year, no touch. No touch. Without touch, people die. I'm just telling you. They become alienated. They become alone. Touch is a really vital thing. Not only that, it's vital for immunity, right? If we don't touch one another, we can't pass viruses and stimulate antibodies between humans. It happens if I was to shake your hand right now, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million viri would change between the two of us. Most of them aren't going to penetrate each other's skin in the first place. And even if they did, you already have antibodies to be immune to it. But that is part of normal biology and function. So what I'm really trying to say is that we fully recognize that chemicals are capable of producing thought in the brain. They can replace thought in the brain. And with the right chemicals, sometimes it's in the form of a nutraceutical. You know, nature produces hundreds of thousands and millions of chemicals in fruits and vegetables and what have you, right? We're just not taking full advantage of these things. So that's just kind of how we view this, rather than that person was just born crazy and then they had this event and now the crazy just came out more. You know, there's people that think that way, and it is so backwards and arcane. We might as well dunk people, you know, in rivers and chairs, and if they don't drown, they didn't have mental disease, and if they do, well, we don't know because they drowned. They can't tell us. You know, we need to do away with this. We need to have a paradigm shift. That's what needs to occur in mental illness, and concussion leads to mental illness. It does. And generally, most concussions are self-initiated because we're involved in a game of sport and we take the risk and we suffer a head injury, or we drive our car and we get in a car accident, or we're walking down the steps and we trip and we bang our head. On the other hand, there are people who are banged over the head, and that's a different kind of trauma, right? So at the end, what is really going on in here that would take that person from that event to somewhere 6 months, 6 years down the road, they take their life? Because it happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. It does happen all the time.
Right back to that event.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you bringing this up, Tim, in this manner, because I do think it is a paradigm shift where people start looking at their brain and considering it as the ruler of the entire empire of your body and your mind and how your life works out. And so when you don't recognize in yourself that you've got symptoms or something going on, sometimes it's the most difficult thing to take feedback from other people when your behavior is, you know, maybe not quote unquote normal or serving you. And one of the things I really appreciate about having this particular Huntington's disease in the family, and the way at least we approached it in our family, was to be as preventative as possible with all of this stuff. So I remember like heavily frowning on, you know, drinking a bunch of alcohol, heavily frowning on, you know, any medications. There was very few medications in our house. But as I got into doing this radio show, well, and into counseling, the number of kids that were on medication for autism and that kind of thing just was skyrocketing, you know. So this last 30 years, we've seen women on Valium, you know, kids on drugs. So all kinds of pharmacology to try to get people to behave in certain ways. And it's not working. We're getting more and more ill. But the ability to actually take somebody else's feedback when your behavior isn't leading you to a life that is the life that's bright and shiny that you want, then it's really hard to change up that reality. But if you're open to thinking about how you could maybe do something different, then it can change your trajectory. I'll give a really simple example. I went and stayed with my dad, who has Huntington's disease, while my mom went on a trip. And it was around Easter time, and they had got a box of those little chocolates, you know, with all the little Snicker bars and all that stuff. And because he has a very significant movement disorder, he can actually eat between 8 and 12,000 calories a day, because that's how much he needs to actually keep his body in good state. Right. Right. But my mom's a great cook. So she's cooking all the time, lots of heavy cream and lots and lots of calories, very good food. But dad got into this box of, the chocolate things. And I noticed because he's so healthy that he started behaving differently within one box of those chocolates. So however many little candies are in that thing, he started being angry, angry. Short-tempered and angry with me, irritable. And so I said to him, so this is, he's 83 and Huntington. So I'm having a conversation with him. He would have been 82 at that time, but have a conversation with him and said, hey, Dad, do you think that this, you're not acting like yourself? Like, I know that you're usually a very, level-headed, compassionate, a calm person and you've been really irritable with me. Do you think it could have anything to do with those chocolate bars and the amount of sugar in them? And he said, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I said, would you be willing to just actually put the chocolate bars away for a couple of days and let's see if your mood improves? And he's like right away, oh yeah, for sure. Chocolate bars went away and mood improved. All the irritability went away. But it's just like because he's like, it's a sensitive thing. Your brain is so sensitive and it responds so quickly when you're healthy to also things that are the like not natural, the anti-natural solutions or the anti-natural things that we feed ourselves or that we're given, in pharmacology.
It's really interesting and up on that, and that the response from him was, sure, let's try that. And then it went away, right? Now, what was the real cause of that? Who knows, right? But something wasn't agreeing with him that was in that chocolate, be it the sugar or the chocolate itself or something else, whatever it was, right? But it shows you how sensitive we really are, right? We just a lot of times don't realize it.
Well, and we've been told
it is the tyranny of busyness, right?
Yes.
We run around 1,000 miles an hour all day long. We never actually slow down to feel how we feel.
Yes, absolutely. And that we've been told, suck it up. You'll be fine. Rub some dirt in it. Get up. Tomorrow's another day. Grow up. Stop being such a whiny person.
Do it again if you don't straighten up. Right.
That's right.
It's all that. But I think that I think situational awareness is changing because we see, for example, people that we put on pedestals like athletes who suffer these long-term injuries from concussion. And then they do something terrible. They murder something like 𝑸𝖗𝙩𝙩𝙩 did, it was a very terrible thing. I mean, what makes a guy who's 26 years old, who has his whole NFL career ahead of him, all of a sudden switch gears and get into gambling dogs or dog fights, and then ends up murdering 2 people and then commits suicide in prison? How does that happen to a person who had everything going for him? The injury, the trauma, untreated, unrecognized. Nobody recognized those symptoms we were talking about. There were changes in him that either people didn't want to see or they saw and they didn't recognize what they were because they didn't know what they were. But in the end, they did an autopsy on Aaron and they autopsied his brain. And out of 111 brains that the University of Boston had looked at, his being like the 111, he had, at 26 years of age, had the worst CTE brain they had examined. He literally had a hole through his brain from top to bottom. The injuries had eaten that brain away. So you all of a sudden can go from condemning a murderer to finding empathy for a guy who had a very serious brain injury and actually had a loss of brain matter. I mean, is that why he murdered people? Or was he just always rotten and evil and no good? No, I think it was the brain injury, right? Yeah. So that's a really magnified example of this. But our little Johnny, who's on the little, we call it Pop Warner football. It's the little kids, they're 7, 8 years old and they're out there playing tackle football and get a head injury. You could be setting, and I'm not trying to send shockwaves of fear into parents. Look, make your decisions, but understand one concussion that has a second concussion and then more, because now you're into a whole adult, from childhood through adolescence, through high school, maybe even into college sports, contact sports. Every one of those injuries can exacerbate things and make it worse. And I think we need to be aware of that first injury that little Johnny or even little Susie has right on the soccer field, or even some of them play football. I think we need to be aware of that from the very beginning and take steps at that moment to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because the history of it and the science that's coming from it is leading to one sort of determination, right? that these injuries can become chronic, and chronic long-term brain injury can lead to things like depression and suicide. There can be the sidearm of that where they end up with dementia or dementia type activity that completely vacates their life of the life they previously had. Now, maybe they're not going to commit suicide because maybe the manifestation of that dementia is so great that suicidal ideation isn't powerful enough to take that over, right? Mm-hmm. But they lost all quality of life, right? So no matter what pathway, it can be bad.
Yeah, and you're still fighting those thoughts every single day.
Yep.
So you're even though you maybe not have executed on that action, just sitting in the boat of thinking about that all day long, or it entering your sphere of thought as something that you would entertain, is absolutely exhausting.
It's terribly sad. It really is. And we shouldn't want anybody, I don't care who they are, to live their life that way, mm-hmm. especially if we can fix it biologically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some people have brain injuries where they suffer a severe trauma and lose brain matter. And, you would say they're maybe in a vegetative sort of, a horrible place to be. That's rare. Yes, that happens in combat. And in times we have lots of people worldwide with military injuries like that, right? It's horrible. It's terrible. But on the scale of us just living out our lives from a day-to-day basis, we're not going to typically have those kinds of injuries, but we are going to have the slip and falls, and we are going to have the concussions and the whiplash injuries and the sports injuries and all these kinds of things. The brain is sort of the last frontier. In immunology, there's really 5 kind of points about immunology. We have adaptive immunity, right? We have innate immunity. And in the middle of that, we have something that sort of regulates that, this compound called interferon gamma. And on the other sides of the interferon gamma, we have the brain biome and we have the gut biome. And all of that needs to be in relative harmony for us to lead a pretty well-balanced life. Any of that can get out of kilter. Our gut can be in dysbiosis and affect the brain biome, right? If the brain biome is affected, it can lead to inflammation in the brain. You go, wait, there wasn't an injury. You don't always have to have an injury for inflammatory molecules to be released by the immune system because things are out of whack. Migraineurs, people who suffer from migraine, on the most part, are the most healthiest people in the world, except for when they have a migraine. And then they're the sickest people in the world. And there is something biologically and chemically that is happening in the brain when that event is occurring, but they recover from it, right? That's a completely different thing. But you know what? At the heart of that migraine, these same inflammatory markers that I'm talking about, things like C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, these are common inflammatory biomarkers. They're at the center of that migraine event. And in fact, interleukin-6 is thought to be the pain signal that occurs in a migraine event, right? People who have migraine have usually unilateral throbbing, right, on one side or the other. They may have vision issues. They may have hearing issues. They may not like light and want darkness to try and quell that. But at the core of it is a chemical disbalance. And now we have things that can break that chemical cycle that's occurring with migraine. There are abortive drugs, right? There are preventative drugs. So why aren't we looking at conditions of depression that maybe began with dementia? Maybe it all began with a concussion that led to some depression. And out of that depression were manifested dementia type symptoms, but at the same time, they still have the depression. Mm-hmm. But it began with some event, didn't it? Right?
It sure did. Yes, and addictions too. Addictions can also be the result of.
They absolutely can, right? So many drugs like methamphetamine and heroin produce these same molecules in the brain that we're talking about. So really all this mapping of these biomarkers is sort of at the core of what we're doing. And we're trying to find things to turn it all off. And that's what we're doing.
It's fantastic science. I love it. And it's so timely because people, again, are becoming aware more and more of just how much control they have of their own health and well-being and how they carry themselves throughout the world. So I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the products. So people with concussion, the products that you've created through Therapeutic Solutions by Community Shield, what would people be looking for specifically to help with concussion, or what would be your recommendations of how they could approach?
I will go right back to both the nanostilbene and the neurostilbene.
Yes.
Those are both prime. And the reason why is because it's been designed across the brain-blood barrier. So these little nanoparticles are so small, they go everywhere. And whether you take it intranasally up the nose in the form of neurostilbene, which is a diluted concentration of the original nanostilbene. And I think we may have talked about that before. The nanostilbene is just too potent to put up the nostril. Mm-hmm. So we dilute it and we provide that in a formulation that delivers a couple of milligrams at a time. It's all you need for the brain. You don't need to take the same amount as you would orally, right, by mouth, to get it up into the brain. The presence of that molecule, pterostilbene, in the brain immediately begins reducing those inflammatory molecules. So listen, in cancer-produced inflammation, which again are these same TNF alpha, interleukin 6, C-reactive protein, all of these inflammatory molecules that degrade health, they can be produced by tumors as well. Mm-hmm. And so this molecule works to reduce that inflammation, whether it came from a tumor or it came from trauma to the brain, right? So that's my primary recommendation, is both the nanostilbene and the neurostilbene. Listen, some people find it strange to put something up their nostril. I get it. Well, then get the nanostilbene. You just have to take a little bit more and you take it by mouth. But all of it is going to circulate into the brain one way or another, and it will reduce that inflammation. Are there other things that you can take naturally from food sources? Sure, there are things that reduce that, but you're not going to get the kind of concentration that you're going to get when you supplement. And that's sort of the key thing. When we say supplement, we're really talking about increasing the amount that you would normally get from nature for an intended purpose for some period of time.
And you're your own playground. You're your own best science experiment. So
and you're your own lab.
You're your own lab. So if you take a supplement, it's like taking the time to notice the differences because they're subtle, but they can also be pretty incredibly significant. So if you notice that depression goes away, anxiety goes away, those suicidal thoughts go away, your whole quality of life is changing. And then all of a sudden your executive functioning starts to be better, and your impulse control and your emotional control starts to improve. And then again, your whole relationship starts to get better.
You begin feeling better. Right? There's a magic point there where all of a sudden the body too, just in a physical kind of way, I'm getting up, I'm going out, I'm doing things, I'm energized. I have interest in things again. Oh, my hobbies interest me. Why? Well, something happened because before you weren't too interested in that stuff, but then you started taking this and now you're interested. What happened? Well, look at what the science says that compound does. And generally, it's reduce inflammation. Look, we're going to either upregulate or downregulate the immune system. And the end result usually is, I feel better.
Awesome.
My elbows are working again. I used to have this just achiness all the time. And it's, well, what happened? Well, I began taking a supplement. But wait a minute, I eat my fruits, I eat my vegetables. See, they just weren't giving you enough. Don't stop eating those things either, by the way, just because you take supplements, right?
So if you're ready to discover some things, or you're looking for solutions that are physical to help you with your physical health, your mental well-being, your cognitive functioning, then come to the masteryourlife.ca website, the Stuff I Love page, because that's where you're going to find Tim's products and solutions to help you have a happier, healthier life. Tim, we're out of time again. It's just looking forward to the next chat that we have. Everyone, we invite you. Chi hugs. First of all, give everyone a hug energetically.
Yeah. Oxytocin. Release that oxytocin.
Release that oxytocin. Start right now. Love yourselves. Love each other. Mind your minds. That's all for us.
Thank you for being a part of our program today. Master Your Life is a presentation of Leaha Mattinson Enterprises, Inc. Join us next time on Master Your Life, helping you to discover the very best of you.